All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to A Pathway to PCI DSS Compliance for SUNY Institutions. My name is Alyssa Lieberman, and I am the Marketing Manager for CampusGuard. Thank you for joining us today and allowing us this time during your busy schedule. I would like to remind everyone that on top of webinars such as this, in our continuing effort to support and educate our customers and their peers, CampusGuard will also be available at upcoming events such as a roundtable discussion on security and compliance at Oakland University in Rochester Hills, Michigan, for all institutions in the area on August 6th. Procurement Australia's Future-Proofing Procurement in Melbourne, Australia on August 15th. The Association of College and University Auditors, ACUA, AuditCon Conference in Baltimore, September 15th through the 19th. The PCI Security Standards Council North American Community Meeting on September 17th. And finally, presenting at EDUCAUSE's annual conference in Chicago on October 15th, discussing information security or regulation compliance, what's the best response? For an up-to-date list of events, please visit our website at www.campusguard.com. We are excited to get started, but first I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. We expect the actual presentation to last about 45 to 50 minutes with time for your questions at the end. I ask that if you have any questions come to mind during your presentation, that you either send them to me via the Q&A chat on your screen or save them until the very end by virtually raising your hand. We will do our best to cover any and all questions that come through if time permits. And with that, I will turn the mic over to my colleague, Andy Grant. Andy?
Thank you, Alyssa, and good morning, everybody. As Alyssa said, we are certainly excited about this morning's webinar and the opportunity to present with such a fine institution such as SUNY Plattsburgh. I am privileged to be accompanied by such an expert panel today. Let me take this opportunity to introduce my colleagues for today's webinar. Gregory Withrow is an Associate Director of Student Financial Services at SUNY Plattsburgh. He previously worked for colleges and nonprofit organizations in Kansas City, Missouri, and for a major bank in Cincinnati, Ohio. Greg is a former president of the New York State Organization of Bursars and Business Administrators, was a member of the Leadership Council for the New York State Higher Education Services Corporation, chaired the SUNY Bursar Subcommittee, and was on the board of directors of the Kansas City chapter of the Institute of Management Accountants. His honors include a Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Professional Service, a President's Award for Distinguished Service, dedication and commitment from NYSOBA, and an award for outstanding leadership from the State University Bursars Business Officers Association. Greg earned a bachelor's degree from Northern Kentucky University, master's degrees from the University of Kentucky and SUNY Plattsburgh, and a certificate from AMI. Jeff Burt has worked in the information technology industry for over 20 years, which includes 15 years of information security experience. Jeff began his career as an IT engineer providing services to companies that did not have their own computer services department. He then moved into the healthcare industry as an information security analyst, where he expanded his knowledge to include HIPAA and SOX security practices in addition to the normal duties of protecting critical systems and confidential information. At Bowling Green State University, Jeff was responsible for many aspects of information security, including being responsible for assisting the university in becoming compliant with the payment card industry data security standards. At CampusGuard, he assists other campus-based institutions to increase their knowledge of information security, along with helping them to reach compliance. And myself, Andy Grant, have over 20 years of hands-on experience working in campus-based environments in numerous areas of information technology, ranging from frontline support to managerial oversight. As the Director of National Development and a member of the CampusGuard leadership team, I am responsible for discovering new business relationships and developing and maintaining solid long-term alliances with CampusGuard customers and partners. Prior to joining CampusGuard, I spent 15 years in higher education involving strategic decisions as Director of Business Operations for a large state institution. Moving to today's agenda, we will be covering a number of topics today. Greg will start us off with an overview of SUNY Plattsburgh. I will follow Greg and provide a brief overview of CampusGuard and move on to talk about some of the challenges we see today in the higher education environment and why achieving a PCI compliant environment is so important. From there, we will turn the conversation over to Greg and Jeff to discuss some of the challenges SUNY Plattsburgh faced during their PCI journey and approach to becoming PCI compliant and the best practices that can be deployed to help achieve a PCI DSS environment. In the end, and pending our allotted time, we will conclude with the Q&A session from the audience. If we find that time is running short and we have to end our Q&A session sooner than expected, please continue to send questions to my email on the Q&A slide, and we will follow up with the audience and the answers to any outstanding questions. Greg, can you start us off by giving us an overview of the SUNY Plattsburgh landscape?
Sure, Andy. Our college began in 1889 as a teacher's college, known as a normal school back then. And for about 50 years, we worked with teachers, aspiring teachers, to help them prepare for their careers before we became part of SUNY in the mid-40s. We have two campuses. Our main campus is in Plattsburgh, and then we have a branch campus in Queensbury. And we have an operating budget of a little over $72 million when you consider all funds. We are number 10 out of 13 in size in terms of student head count, so we're among the smallest third of the SUNY University colleges. And we have primarily undergrad programs. That's where most of our student head count is from. But we do have a few graduate programs, including data analytics and an online fitness, wellness, and leadership program as well. Most of our student employees are students with temp service, work study, and we have some directors and assistant room or dorm directors as well. Next slide, please. We are a merchant level 3 in terms of category for credit card and debit card processing, because we have about a little over 10,000 transactions per year. We use CashNet and Authorize.net as our third-party vendors, and we use 3 different types of SAQs. And by area, those are P2PE, which we'll talk about a little later, and then a couple of others, A and B. We have 6 SAQs that we have to complete each year, and those are allocated between our auxiliary services operation, institutional advancement, and then we have several merchants that roll up into one SAQ for our campus. Andy?
Thank you, Greg. A little information about CampusGuard. CampusGuard is an information security, privacy, and compliance company that specializes in organizations that have complex campus-based environments, much like the environment at SUNY Plattsburgh, as Greg described, other SUNY institutions, and many other institutions of higher education. We are thrilled this year to be celebrating our 10th anniversary. We are proud to say that we are the only QSA and ASV firm that is focused on higher education, and 95% of our customers are within higher education. Many of our security advisors and customer relationship managers are from the higher education sector, giving us an advantaged insight to our customer base and the issues they face on a daily basis. We perform PCI compliance assessments, other compliance assessments, vulnerability scans, penetration tests, ongoing support, training, and much more. Lastly, for each of these services, you have a dedicated customer advocate team, which consists of an assigned customer relationship manager and a primary security advisor. They're backed by a team of information security and compliance specialists. As a member and extension of your organization, they are able to stay closely involved with you throughout the life of the engagement. From weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly calls to project management and handling ad hoc inquiries, to scheduling site visits and annual reviews and everything in between. This team-based approach ensures that you have all the qualified and certified personnel to deliver the highest quality of customer care available in the market. So CampusGuard is a QSA and an ASV. What does that really mean? CampusGuard remains both, and a qualified security assessor company, an independent security organization that has been qualified by the PCI Security Standard Council to validate an entity's adherence to the PCI DSS. As an individual, such as Jeff, with the QSA certification, these are individuals who are employed by a QSA company, such as CampusGuard, and have satisfied and continue to satisfy all QSA requirements. Requirements such as holding an information security certification, an audit certification, and passing an initial exam. Also, Jeff and all other QSAs have to requalify every year to maintain their QSA status. As an ASV, we have to set of security services and tools, such as our ASV scanning solution, to conduct external scanning vulnerability services to validate adherence with the external scanning requirements of the PCI DSS requirement 11.2.2. The scanning vendor's ASV scan solution is tested and approved by the PCI Council before an ASV is added to the Council's list of approved scanning vendors. A firm's ASV solution has to be validated every year for that firm to remain an ASV firm. And much like the individuals who hold the QSA certification, the individuals who hold the ASV must also requalify every year to maintain an active certification. Jeff, can you give the audience an example of why you would want to work with a QSA over a firm who doesn't hold that designation?
Sure, thanks, Andy. I'd say there's a few reasons. The three main reasons that I want to talk about today are the knowledge base, I guess, that we provide. For those of you not familiar, the PCI DSS manual, or the standard itself, is probably about 140 pages alone. And then we have hundreds of other documents like informational supplements, FAQs, et cetera, that it's just nice to have an individual that's been trained and educated on all these different forms and the way things are supposed to work. In addition to that, we provide a lot of assistance with determining how many payment processes exist on campus when we meet with the different merchants. And this helps us assist the institution with the testing compliance. And I think you've heard the term SAQ already in the presentation, and you'll probably hear it again. But the SAQ is the self-assessment questionnaire. And this is how most institutions in the higher ed space attest their compliance to their acquiring bank, who is who you receive your merchant IDs from. And I guess lastly, one other thing that comes up is, which you don't think about generally, is in addition to dealing with acquiring banks, is sometimes there is some questions that may arise on how you're supposed to handle certain situations or handle certain requirements, sub-requirements. And generally the answer that you're going to get when you're talking to your acquiring bank is talk to your QSA. So those are three main reasons. There's a lot more that pop up during the engagements, but I'll leave it at that.
From my point as a merchant on campus, my perspective is if there's a breach, who do you want on your team? And of course, you can't afford not to have a QSA in your corner in that situation.
Thanks for that insight, Greg and Jeff. Let's move on to some of the typical challenges we see institutions facing today. First, a network on a college or university campus is often open and easily accessible to students, faculty, staff, and guests. The IT side is challenged to ensure that the network is secure, that sensitive student data or highly valuable research data are protected from outsiders. But that security must be balanced against limitations or constraints that are introduced when adding in things like multi-factor authentication. Next, higher education is all about collaboration, making sure that students can work on projects together, faculty can share ideas, and the institution can partner with other organizations to do groundbreaking research. This is more easily done when everyone has access to everything, but that creates a security issue of its own. Think also about the custom application that the theater needs to handle their business, the specialty systems that the foundation wants to use, and the many other varied systems across campus that everyone believes should be integrated. And now you have an idea of the complexities of a typical college campus. And in fact, that technology changes every 12 to 18 months. Your customers are continually asking for more, better, faster, newer options, and you can see what higher education is facing. Now overlay that with one of the most prescriptive standards for information security, and you begin to understand why this is such a big deal. Greg, can you tell us how this relates to the situation at SUNY Plattsburgh?
Sure. The committee that we have for PCI DSS compliance, we have to have some options for our merchants across campus when they have a need that comes up. And we need to be able to provide them with options that are user-friendly as well as compliant with the data security standard. For example, before we had this in place, we had one professor that wanted to sell some books, the Saranac Review, on our campus. And so he signed up for a PayPal account, but we didn't know about that at the time because we didn't have the infrastructure in place, and he didn't know he needed to contact us to run it by us to make sure that it was a secure pathway for credit card information. Also, we've had folks in the past that did ask us if they could use their personal cell phones with a square when they're out on the road in order to collect donations for the college via credit card. So those are a couple of examples where we try to be customer friendly, but also have the balance with data security. Can you go to the next slide, please? In the beginning, before we signed on with CampusGuard, we had a lot of issues. And primarily, initially, me, as I first learned about it from conferences in New York, primarily NYSOBA conferences. First of all, the first time I heard about SAQ, QSA, and PCI DSS, I had no idea what that meant. So I didn't know what the standard was. I didn't know anything about our campus networks and all the protocols and firewalls in place because I previously never had any need to know that. I didn't have a grasp as to what was considered in scope according to PCI DSS and what wasn't. I didn't have anyone else on campus that knew the data security standard at that time. And I didn't know how the network and applications were configured, as I said. Before PCI DSS came around in the mid-2005, somewhere around there, we had purchased our e-commerce software because we like to own what we use. At least we did back then. But then realized once we were learning more and more about the data security standard that by owning our own e-commerce software, we were having all of that credit card information on our own internal network. So everything was in scope. That was another issue. We also were using an in-house form created for Banner where we were collecting credit card information when students and their family members called in to make payments. And that was through Banner, not our e-commerce software. And therefore, that was in scope. We didn't know it. And we were using multi-purpose computers. We got notice from our bank wanting us to confirm compliance with PCI DSS, but we really didn't get any direction from the bank in terms of how to fill out what form or even what was the standard about and how to get some answers to some questions, basic fundamental questions we had. So that was kind of the environment in the beginning. I felt overwhelmed because there was so much to learn about the security standard. Because it's so pervasive across campus, I didn't have the authority to mandate other members of campus, other merchants to do something without some formal structure in place to do that. And of course, at that time, there wasn't any PCI DSS committee on our campus. So very, very much I felt alone with this.
Thanks, Craig. We're going to talk about some of the consequences of being non-compliant. And so there are many potential consequences when dealing with non-compliant PCI environment. As Greg described, in his environment, the first many think of are the financial consequences. If an institution suffers a breach, they're subject to fines up to $500,000 per card brand per breach. Given that there are 5 major card brands out there, this has the potential for a $2.5 million consequence just for one breach. Place that on top of all the expenses the breaching party must endure, such as all the costs surrounding the communication of the breach, reimbursing all the individuals for card reissuance, and the cost to pay for credit card monitoring of a breach party. They're looking at significant losses. Then factor in the necessity for a forensic investigation team and the remediation costs and increased rates. One breach can be extremely catastrophic. Other consequences a breach party faces are the automatic requirements to have a report on compliance done by an outside third party, the possibility of losing the ability to accept credit cards altogether, and the reputational risk once the news of this breach hits the newspapers, televisions, and especially the internet. Jeff, from a technical perspective, what are your thoughts on the consequences outlined?
Thanks, Andy. They're all significant, all important. Obviously, the $500,000 fine per breach stands out. It's a lot of money. One of the less thought about is probably the reputational risk, especially when you're dealing with institutions that don't realize anything that's happening on your campus may affect that reputation. But I wanted to take a little time and elaborate on the second bullet point, which is the annual report on compliance. So before I do that, I need to tech out a little bit and give you a little brief history on merchant levels and what they mean. So I know it's come up a few times on the presentation already, but there are 4 merchant levels, and they deal with annual transactions, right, for the institution. So typically what we see in the higher education space is a level 3 or level 4. As Greg mentioned, they're a level 3. And these are institutions that, perform less than 1 million transactions per year, okay? So with that comes the ability to self-assess. So you've heard the term self-assessment questionnaire, right? So this is where we have the ability to approach our banks on an annual basis and fill out these self-assessment questionnaires on our own. Whereas a merchant level 1 or 2, these entities consist of transactions of above 1 million, right? And specifically, level 1, when we get to that level, we're now dealing with the need to have some type of qualified individual, come into the environment and approve it, basically an audit. So that being said, one of the more unknown consequences that's on this slide is if you do have a payment breach, guess what? You get to be part of what I call the level 1 club, right? So now as part of this level 1 club, you have to hire a QSA, whether it's CampusGuard or not, and to come in and complete this report on compliance. And I know I mentioned some lengthy documents earlier, but this is probably one of the most lengthy, 300 pages of fun. This has to be completed by the QSA and submitted to the acquiring bank for attestation. So in layman's terms, it's a glorified audit, but it can be extremely expensive and time consuming. And in addition to that, guess what? You get to stay in this level 1 club for a while, right? So until the acquiring bank deems you're okay to come back to your normal level, that's where you're at.
Thanks, Jeff. Let's move forward to path to compliance. Jeff, can you speak to the initial steps outlined here and walk our audience through a path to becoming compliant?
Sure, thanks, Andy. The typical path, I'll try not to elaborate too much, but the typical path once the customer comes on board is for us to send out a welcome letter to the institution. And what the first step is usually for them to start thinking about their PCI committee. And this committee that we talk about usually consists of members throughout the organization, so a mix of executive leadership, maybe compliance, internal audit, definitely information, IT or IT security. And also what most people don't realize is we also like to have at least one merchant representing that group as well, right? So they can talk about how it's working in the trenches. So once we send out that letter and they're working on getting the PCI committee gathered, we schedule a kickoff call and we go over their current status and we talk about the upcoming visit. There'll be a visit involved, and we kind of get a grasp on what kind of documentation they have, and then we set the dates. And so when we have an on-site assessment, this typically for 3 to 5 days, depending on the number of merchants involved. And we typically start that process off by having a Monday morning meeting with the PCI committee, and we discuss any obstacles, goals, those types of things, and any challenges they're facing with specific merchants. And then we kind of talk about the next 3 days, 3 or 4 days that we're going to be meeting with merchants, right? So we move on to the merchant level, to the merchant meetings, and I don't discriminate. They all get the same questionnaire, probably about 10 or 12 questions. The purpose of this is try to gather all the information on how they do business and all the different ways they take credit cards. So after the last day of the merchant visit, we meet with the committee again, and we kind of go over, have a summary meeting talking about, like anything that's high risk, anything that needs remediated immediately, those types of things. And then we leave campus. I think 3 to 5 days is enough for PCI, and we head back home and we create this fun gap assessment report. As Greg mentioned, his was over 100 pages, right? So what that report consists of is our findings. We map that to the PCI DSS to let the organization know how they're doing, any areas they're falling short, areas they're meeting, et cetera. And then along with that report will be a the roadmap was mentioned as well today. It's like an overall roadmap of how to move towards remediating any issues and becoming PCI compliant.
Thanks, Jeff. So understanding the typical CampusGuard process, let's talk a little bit about how we applied that at SUNY Plattsburgh specifically. Greg, who did you and how did you choose your PCI DSS compliance committee at SUNY Plattsburgh?
I started by having a conversation around the table with an assistant vice president on our campus who has the role of publishing and maintaining and updating campus-wide policies, as well as serving as our campus liaison with SUNY Legal Counsel. But the other person I had a conversation with at that time was our Assistant Chief Information Officer. So among the three of us, we talked about how many people should be on this PCI DSS Compliance Committee, we call it, and what roles should be represented at the table when this committee is formed. We decided 7 was a good number because it was large enough to have a broad representation regarding all the different facets and roles of campus employees involved with payment card transactions. And we also decided that we needed strong representation from merchants because this really was our key end user. So of the 7 committee members, we had 4 merchants, and that's still the case with our current committee. I serve as the chair because Student Accounts is the largest merchant on campus, and so that was a natural fit. We also have a merchant representative with our controller from our Auxiliary Services Corp. We have a merchant from Institutional Advancement, and this individual also serves as our campus internal control coordinator. And then we have a 4th merchant that's somewhat of a merchant at large, and she represents the field house where we have all of our athletic events throughout the year. The remaining 3 members, I mentioned our assistant vice president. He's on the committee for use in his expertise with legal and policy. We have our networking manager, and then the 7th member is our data security analyst who also chairs our campus information security committee.
Thanks, Greg. Let's move on to steps 2 and 3 with Jeff.
Sure, thanks, Andy. So before we get started, the gap assessment and the report, we touched on them briefly, but I know you've heard this word scope several times, or PCI scope today. Just wanted to give you the actual definition for those of you who weren't familiar. So the literal definition is basically all people, processes, and technology that are involved with any of the transmission, processing, or storage of cardholder data, right? So that's quite a mouthful. One of the most important things learned from the gap assessment is how much of the environment is going to be in the scope, right? And so how many options exist or may potentially exist for reducing this exposure. We're going to touch on that in a couple of slides, but I wanted to give you a definition of scope for now. And in regards to scope, the gap assessment helps us with mapping the environment, number 3 on the list here. And that kind of, you've heard the terms cardholder data environment, CDE, and that's basically, once we've determined the scope of your institution, this will make up how many systems or people are involved in your CDE. I know, another acronym. So once we get the gap assessment report, gap assessment completed, we talked a little bit about the report. As I mentioned earlier, it's basically a synopsis of the information was gathered, the gaps from on site, and its purpose is to reach the goal of PCI compliance. It's broken down into an executive summary, and it talks about the institution in general. It also is broken down into the merchant areas so they can be on board and see what obstacles they have in front of them. Some of the typical items that you see are, again, a biggie: policies and procedures, developing security awareness program, and then also the last step here, the bank status, right? So determining the method of letting the acquiring bank know that we're compliant. So this is done by completing the self-assessment questionnaire generally with the higher ed space. And our job is to make sure that each merchant is assigned with the correct SAQ, as we call it, and they know how to complete that. In summary, there's also a roadmap on the report that gives us the ability to, the list that Greg mentioned earlier, where we talked about a list of items to address. This is the high-level roadmap, and then when we meet after the engagement, we'll talk about tweaking that to a more fine-tuned project plan, and that's going to be based on timing, finances, and resources, etc.
Thanks, Jeff. That's all great information. Greg, when you received this report on your end, what did you do with it?
First thing I did was I made several copies so that each member of the compliance committee had one. I also made a copy for each member of the executive team because it's critically important that they're on board and they're aware of where we're at with this. But I also made copies of their respective merchant pages and gave a copy of those sections to each respective merchant so that they knew what the outcome of the visit was about. From that point, we had a meeting about 2 to 4 weeks after we received the roadmap. And as a committee, we discussed it, we reviewed it, and then we discussed priorities and timeline, which was also provided in the roadmap. And what's especially beneficial for us is that CampusGuard has 6 different color codes based on the urgency of the corrective measures. So we use that to determine what needs to be done quickly and what needs to be done over time, but not necessarily immediately. We shared information with our merchants, and we began working with them with help of our QSA to get them on board. We had monthly meetings, and the first part of our monthly compliance committee meetings consisted of a conference call with our QSA where we bounced issues off of him and then got feedback and direction on how to deal with those issues. Then when we concluded our conference call with our QSA each month, we then had our internal meeting. Based on the feedback from our QSA, we worked out some detailed steps for remediation and going forward, what to do, who to contact, things of that sort. Andy?
Thanks, Greg. Jeff, as SUNY Plattsburgh Security Advisor, can you talk a little bit about some of the key items you covered during these meetings, especially following the gap assessment?
Sure, Andy. So right after the gap assessment, and I know we're going to talk about scope again, but as part of the process, the first thing we need to do is determine what can be done at this institution to reduce and maybe even eliminate the scope, right? This, in my eyes, is definitely the most important step and the first thing that I address. The reason it's so crucial is you really can't get started on the whole process until of creating a compliant environment until you know exactly what all systems and people are going to be involved, right? And what the university or college can handle, what they can sustain. So what we typically find is that if customers coming in after the gap assessment, if they continue to do payment card processes in their current manner, this is going to require them to have extensive time and resources from their IT departments to implement, maintain, build a compliant networking and system environment. An example of what might cause that would be obviously the storage, the electronic storage of cardholder data, and I know I don't see it a lot, but trust me, I have seen it out there. We have over 300 customers, and I've been to over 40 myself, and I've seen it several times. There are people that actually do store electronic cardholder data, believe it or not. But the other would be, I think I mentioned this earlier, is you have a website that you have good intentions to outsource all the PCI compliance to a third party and have your customers make their payments online. But for whatever reason, it's usually customer service related, we're allowing our employees to have these customers call in, and we're entering that on their behalf, right? So in other words, we're using our computers, laptops, etc., these general use computers that we use for everything else, to enter this payment card information to the same site. So in either of these cases, that's not a complete list, but these scenarios are going to make it necessary for you to build a secure environment, and that scope, that nasty word scope, increases as the more involvement that you have. So for those of you that aren't familiar, that would probably mean close to 330 requirements or sub-requirements that you need to meet for PCI compliance. So because of this, CampusGuard and myself, we typically work with our customers on recommending solutions that will help assist, reducing or even eliminating scope. One of the most common ones, that you've heard about, and I think Greg even mentioned today, is this term of P2PE, right, which is point-to-point encryption. There's also E2EE, which is end-to-end encryption. But don't get those confused with what we're discussing today. Those terms get thrown around quite a bit, but what we're referring to when we're talking about literally reducing scope is a PCI listed or validated P2PE solution, right? So what the council has said is if we use one of these solutions in our environment, that anything that it's attached to, whether that's the system, the network, etc., that can take that out of scope, right? So when you do that, you dramatically reduce your surface and your cardholder data environments, and you can work your way down to a lesser SAQ that's been mentioned today, where you're only answering maybe a couple dozen questions. So, Greg, can you briefly talk about what reduction of scope's done for SUNY Plattsburgh?
It's been a tremendous move forward for us in terms of better customer service, and it's easier for the employees collecting the credit card information because they just type it in a keypad with the P2PE that's approved by the council, and it's done. It takes a lot of the networking issues out of scope that we would have to deal with if we didn't have those devices. And because the scope is reduced, the SAQs we have to prepare have fewer questions. So it's been a win-win for us.
Thanks, Greg. So once the scope has been reduced or maybe even eliminated, we then kind of move on to the next slide, which we talk about the securing the cardholder data environment, the CDE as you have it. So this is going to totally depend on what that conversation that just took place, right? Meaning, so what is decided to implement and how that affects your scope. If we're able to reduce or eliminate scope by using potentially one of these PCI listed solutions, or maybe even using the PTS devices that the bank provides for us, the approved devices. We're all familiar with probably some of those, the Verifone and Genicos of the world. Then we're reducing our platform to where the securing our cardholder data environment really is the devices, right? So we're talking about making sure that they're insecure when they're being used and in storage, inspecting them for tampering and substitution, etc. And then the rest of it really is to make sure that all our policies and procedures in place. So when Greg was talking about the fewer questions, that's the luxury that you get, right? So you're talking about the devices being the only thing in scope, and then making sure they're secure, and then making sure you have all your policies and procedures. I'm making light of it, but that's basically what you're getting. So if we're in a situation where we're not able to do that, for whatever reason, and we continue to do things that make us in the SAQD world, where we're going to have to deal with 330 some odd requirements and sub-requirements. Some of the typical areas that you might be familiar with, any of the IT folks on the call. So we're talking about change management. That means keeping track of all the changes that take place in the environment anytime something happens. Logging, right? Making sure that all the systems and network devices are being logged and monitored. Vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, and so on, right? So these all add up. They get expensive, and they also take a lot of internal FTEs resources to set that up. Not going to go into too much detail, but that would apply to anything that's in scope. As you can see, as I've mentioned already, this is a tremendous amount of resources to accomplish the meeting of these requirements. And so for that reason, and for most of our customers like SUNY Plattsburgh, they decide to go in other routes and reduce as much scope as possible. Greg, you want to briefly touch on what the process may have been like without having scope reduction?
In addition to what I said about not needing to work on firewall configurations and things like that, the ramification of that is we didn't have to spend a lot of money in terms of human resources and equipment in order to set up those firewalls. So that's an additional benefit we experienced.
Thanks, Greg. So one of the things we're going to touch on that we talked about it briefly in several other slides that can't be overlooked is more of a non-technical piece, and that's with the policies and procedures. Greg, can you share a little bit about how that worked at SUNY Plattsburgh?
Sure. We started with a template we got from our document locker, the secured site we have with CampusGuard. And when we got that document and downloaded it, we then began parsing out those elements that are policy versus elements that are procedure. And what we did was we boiled down the policy elements and created a basic campus-wide PCI DSS policy for SUNY Plattsburgh. Then we got that approved by Exec Council. And once that was approved, that was our campus standard for how we were going to handle sensitive payment card information. What we did then was we created a program manual, and we distributed that to all of our merchants to let them have their own working copy. And after that, we created a template, campus-wide template of a procedure, including all the different types of methods of collecting payment card information that we use on our campus. And then we gave that to each one of our merchants for them to pare that down based on how they do business. For example, if we had 4 different types of ways of collecting payment card information, a merchant, let's say in the art museum, might only use one of them, a dial-up modem. So that individual for that merchant's area would only cut out things that did not pertain, and they could customize it. It basically prevented them from having to start from scratch, and we were able to create the framework within which they were able to develop their own. And then they presented it to us. We edited it, tweaked it, and then gave it back to them. So that's how we went about the process.
Thanks, Greg. We've almost got, it's almost time for Q&A, but Greg, I wanted to touch on one thing really quick. What were some of the best practices CampusGuard deployed at SUNY Plattsburgh?
One of them was the template that CampusGuard provided us as a starting point, because we're not the authority and expert in PCI DSS. We needed help, and that helped us tremendously. It gave us something to start with. And of course, it's a lot easier to edit a document than it is to start from scratch and create it on your own. And because CampusGuard knows the standard. We had a lot of confidence in that document having policy and procedure elements that were compliant with the standard. Some other best practices. I mentioned earlier about our committee. We got a formal letter from our president giving each one of us an appointment to the committee. That gave us authority to act on behalf of the campus to help everybody move toward compliance. We have a direct reporting line to our vice president for administration, so we're in the organizational structure that way. And the remaining best practice that we got from CampusGuard is those procedures and policies from each merchant. We review those every year, make sure that they're still compliant according to the regs, and that they're updated based on any changes each merchant may have made in how they process payment card information, as well as any additional use of technology that may not have been the case a year prior. So that's what we came up with. It's a culture change, and so we need to make sure that the whole campus is aware of the standard and how they fit into it.
Well, thank you everyone for this presentation. I'd like to finish this up by thanking everyone else on this call for your submitted questions thus far. We have a little time remaining, so we're going to get through as many as possible. I'd like to remind everyone that they can either submit their questions to me via the Q&A chat feature or raise your hands virtually so I can unmute your line. I also have included the entire customer advocate team's contact information on the slide, as well as any grants for everyone's convenience. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be able to be viewed off our website in the next couple of days. So as I get these questions in, I'm going to start with the first. Oh, this is a good one. What other SUNY schools do you work with? Andy, I'll let you take that one.
Other SUNY schools. We work with SUNY Albany, SUNY Binghamton, Brockport, Buffalo, Delhi, FIT, Fredonia, Geneseo, Genesee Community College, Oneonta, Oswego, and finally Plattsburgh.
That's impressive, Andy. Thank you. And this next one is for Greg. Did you encounter any internal resistance? How did you get everyone on board?
Fortunately, we have a very good group of people that deal with credit card transactions, payment card information. I'm not aware of any resistance, but what we all had at the beginning was just ignorance. We didn't know what PCI DSS meant. So the first task for me and the committee was to learn more about that, and we did through our interactions with our QSA. But then once we had a better handle on it, our role was to communicate that to our merchants. And of course, the annual 2-day visit that our QSA comes to campus, we really use that as the foundation for communicating any things that are changing on the horizon in terms of payment card activity, including some videos of folks defrauding others with their credit card information, how that works. But also we use those 2 days to show all the merchants, walk them through each of the SAQs each merchant deals with, and how to properly answer those questions based on their own credit card environment. Sometimes the questions are confusing because they're a little awkward the way they're worded. So our QSA helps everyone to understand that better and to have a more informed and more accurate response to those questions. We share a lot of information among our SUNY peers. We're all a tight group, and so our listserv and our ABB meetings and NYSOBA conferences, we have some of those presentations about PCI DSS. So in a nutshell, I have a very good committee, and we have very good merchants that want to do the right thing, and they're willing to learn.
Thanks, Fred. That seems to be the last question. Thank you to all that inquired. Andy, any last words?
Nothing much. I'd just like to thank everyone for joining the call today. As Alyssa mentioned before, we'll be making the recording of this webinar available in the next couple of days. So if you or any of your colleagues would think would benefit from this information or hearing it again, please do share. Thanks again to Jeff and of course Greg at SUNY Plattsburgh. Have a great day, everyone.